concept that you are permitted to do anything unless you're specifically forbidden to do it, that's British.
There was always an important difference between the police in Britain and practically anywhere else in the world. Here, they were the servants of the law and the friends of the public. Elsewhere, they were the servants of the state. Increasingly, in Britain, they are turning into the servants of the state, and of a pretty intolerant state at that.
But senior ministers shrug off these fears. They say nothing fundamental is changing.
What is it that makes them think these things are what a police force ought to be doing?
Again, I can't comment on the individual items,
sure,
and I don't know the facts in each of the individual items that you refer to.
It's a general question.
But is that, I question whether those particular examples represent the attitudes of the police across the country. The police's daily lives are not engaged, I would anticipate, in determining whether or not somebody's been guilty of racism because they've attacked the Welsh. Make a balanced judgment about how the police have changed. And I believe the police have changed very considerably over the last 8 years, but it's a process that's been going on for a period before that.
On that, we can both agree that the changes are not ones we should be welcoming.
The system itself is the problem. We are trying to fight 21st century crime, antisocial behaviour, drug dealing, binge drinking, organised crime, with 19th century methods.
The governments say they're acting for the public good, and they don't need the old restraints. Trust us, they say. But what they don't say is that if we do trust them, we will be giving up the freedom we've enjoyed for centuries. Parliament has many times been the protector of our liberties, defying would-be tyrants and even overthrowing them. But not so in this era of the professional politician and mass propaganda.
I'm on my way to Victoria Tower at Westminster. Inside this majestic piece of Victorian fantasy architecture, the title deeds of English liberty are actually stored and still to be found.
The wise old cynics who devised our Constitution assumed that power would always be abused unless strong restraints were placed upon it. They were as right in the 17th century as they are now. Probably the most important laws they passed are the Habeas Corpus Act and the Bill of Rights, which state what government cannot do. No wonder today's rulers would prefer they were forgotten in the darkness.
I have never held in my hands anything so valuable as these two documents, the Bill of Rights and the Habeas Corpus Act. And I'm surrounded here in the Parliamentary Archives by similar documents, the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of history in which English people have limited power by law. Increasingly, we and our governments forget and ignore that history and seek to set aside that experience in pursuit of an illusory security which, far from making us safer, endangers the very freedom embodied in these archives.
Governments of both parties have recently sought to look tough by attacking these very limits on their power.
We're seeing laws that will allow people to be arrested without necessarily any consideration of the seriousness of the offence they might have caused. So I do think we're at the brink of a very dangerous situation.
The move to allow detention of suspects for 30 days is a direct blow at habeas corpus, which is meant to prevent anyone being held without charge. What's more, Labour and Tory governments have seriously discussed limiting jury trial.
I think the government wants to limit jury trial. One of the reasons for the jury being there as well is, of course, much greater transparency, and that of itself actually prevents any miscarriages of justice in the system itself.
The Prime Minister himself clearly thinks that he knows better than centuries of British tradition.
That means a complete change of thinking. It doesn't mean abandoning human rights. It does mean deciding who's come first. I believe three things work. First, a radical extension of summary powers to police and local authorities to take on the wrongdoers.
Summary powers are just what the famous Magna Carta set out to get rid of nearly 800 years ago. It declared no man could be locked up or fined except by the legal judgment of his peers. Astonishingly, the same government that brushes aside such things maintains that it is the defender of our freedoms.
Unlike any other government, we put the fundamental restraint of the courts to say that a whole act or a whole part of an act was incompatible with the Human Rights Convention. You know that the House of Lords ruled some of the government's legislation concerning terrorism as incompatible with the Human Rights Convention. We changed the legislation as a result. So far from being more controlling than previous governments, we are less controlling.
But you sound as if you were pleased that your legislation was struck down by the House of Lords, and you sound as if you were pleased that the House of Lords rebelled against so much of your legislation.
I am pleased that we've created a structure where there are appropriate checks and balances.
How is it that these benevolent, liberal-minded people have ended up presiding over the current bonfire of liberties?
Defend the children of the poor and punish the wrongdoer. That's what the Victorians thought the criminal justice system was for, but you won't find much punishment in the courts nowadays. For we don't believe in people doing wrong or doing right. We believe that crime is a sickness of society caused by poverty and deprivation and bad housing, and therefore it needs treating. But if it's a sickness, we're all potentially ill.
And as we all potentially have the disease of crime, the state feels justified in finding out more and more about us. In this vision of humanity with everyone a possible offender, the government would like a file on everyone. They've developed new techniques to help them. The Criminal Justice Act of 2003 gave police the right to keep the DNA of anyone they arrest. Since then, they have been building a DNA database. It even contains information on innocent children. You cannot get much more respectable than the London suburb of Harrow, or much more law-abiding than Helen Sabonjian. Her father and her grandfather were both policemen. Her teenage son, Mark, had been seriously thinking of following the family tradition. But one winter's morning, he began to think again.
7:15 in the morning, we were woken up by 3 police officers who said they wanted to speak to my son, and we invited them in, and when my son came downstairs, they arrested him.
Mark had been the witness to a mugging and was wrongly identified as the culprit.
We got to the police station. They took Mark into another room and started to take his photograph and his fingerprints, and they took a swab in his mouth, his DNA.
The police rapidly realized that Mark was innocent. Helen assumed his DNA record would be destroyed.
I said to the police officer, what's going to happen to his details? Are they going to be removed? And he said no. And we couldn't believe it. It was just not right. He's completely innocent, never committed any crime, so why is he on a database?
You can't make them do it. There's no legal right to force them to take it off.
I've got no right at all. It seems to be very, very difficult to get them removed. There's no procedure in place, it seems like.
Helen has written to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Ian Blair, asking for the records to be removed. But her attitude to the police has changed.
I mean, I say to Mark and my children now, if you see anything, don't get involved. Don't say anything, because you could end up being arrested as Mark was. My dad was a police officer and my granddad was a police officer. Mark had wanted to follow in the family tradition of joining the police force, but after this he's kind of, gone off the idea.
Mark is one of many. There are now 24,000 under-18s on the official DNA database who have never been cautioned or convicted. A Tory MP Grant Shapps is trying to get these records